The gymnasium stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its concrete walls holding the chill of a winter that seemed reluctant to release its grip on the industrial city. Inside, a single figure moved through the shadows, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he prepared for another training session that no coach would supervise and no federation would acknowledge. The equipment surrounding him was decades old, salvaged from facilities that had discarded it as obsolete, repaired so many times that barely any original components remained. The weights he lifted were mismatched, their measurements approximated rather than precise, forcing him to develop an intuitive understanding of resistance that more privileged athletes would never need to acquire. This was the reality of his existence as an athlete, a daily confrontation with obstacles that had been deliberately placed in his path by institutions that feared what he might accomplish if given equal opportunity. The young black man had known from childhood that his path would be different, that the color of his skin would determine not merely how others perceived him but what resources would be made available to him, what doors would open and which would remain permanently sealed. Yet he had also known, with a certainty that defied the logic of his circumstances, that he possessed abilities that transcended the limitations others sought to impose. When he ran, when he jumped, when he pushed his body to its absolute limits, he touched something that felt almost supernatural, a reservoir of physical capacity that seemed to expand rather than diminish with use. The Federation officials who controlled access to elite competition had recognized this potential as well, which was precisely why they had devoted such considerable effort to ensuring it would never be fully realized. The campaign of sabotage had begun so subtly that he initially attributed the difficulties to mere coincidence or administrative incompetence. Training schedules would be changed without notification, leaving him to discover upon arrival that the facility had been reserved for other athletes. Equipment he had been promised would fail to materialize, or would arrive damaged beyond use. Coaching assignments would be reshuffled at the last moment, separating him from mentors who had begun to understand and develop his unique capabilities. Each individual incident could be explained away, dismissed as the inevitable friction of a bureaucratic system with limited resources and competing priorities. But as the pattern continued over months and then years, the intentionality behind these obstacles became impossible to deny. He was not simply unlucky. He was being systematically undermined by people who had decided that his success was incompatible with their vision of what their sport should represent. The realization might have broken a lesser individual, might have convinced him that the forces arrayed against him were too powerful to overcome. Instead, it catalyzed a transformation in his approach to both training and competition. If the official channels would not support his development, he would create alternative pathways. If the established coaches would not work with him, he would become his own coach, studying the science of athletic performance with the same intensity that scholars devoted to their academic disciplines. If the Federation would deny him access to modern facilities, he would extract every possible advantage from whatever resources he could scavenge. His family had migrated northward 2 generations earlier, part of the great movement of Black Americans fleeing the terrorism of the post-Reconstruction South for the uncertain promise of industrial cities that offered at least the theoretical possibility of advancement. His grandfather had worked the steel mills, his father had worked the steel mills, and every expectation suggested that he too would spend his life feeding the furnaces that powered the nation's economy. The athletic talent that emerged during his adolescence represented a potential escape from that predetermined trajectory, a chance to transcend the class boundaries that had constrained his family for as long as anyone could remember. Local coaches noticed him first, marveling at physical capabilities that seemed almost designed in a laboratory rather than developed through training. He won youth competitions with such dominance that opponents began withdrawing rather than face the humiliation of being so thoroughly outclassed. Regional scouts came to observe him, their reports using language that would have seemed hyperbolic if the performances had not been documented on video. The recruiting process that followed exposed him for the first time to the full complexity of racial dynamics in elite athletics. White institutions wanted his talent but not his presence, offering arrangements that would have required him to train separately from other athletes and to absent himself from team social functions. Black institutions lacked the resources to provide the caliber of coaching and facilities that his abilities demanded. He navigated this landscape with a pragmatism that belied his youth, accepting what support he could obtain while never allowing himself to become dependent on any single source of patronage. The national federation that governed his sport operated according to principles that had been established decades earlier, when the participation of black athletes had been explicitly prohibited rather than merely discouraged. The formal barriers had been removed, but the institutional culture remained saturated with assumptions about who belonged in elite competition and who represented an intrusion into spaces that should remain exclusive. The officials who controlled selection for international competitions exercised their authority with minimal accountability, their decisions shielded from review by processes designed to protect institutional prerogatives rather than athlete welfare. When the young black athlete first came to their attention, their response combined grudging acknowledgement of his talent with determination to prevent that talent from achieving its full expression. The sabotage escalated as his performances made exclusion increasingly difficult to justify. Training camps to which he had been formally invited would be relocated without his being informed. Transportation arrangements would fall through at critical moments. Medical support that other athletes received as a matter of course would be denied to him on technical grounds. Sponsorship opportunities that should have flowed naturally from his competitive success were blocked through whisper campaigns that portrayed him as difficult, unreliable, or insufficiently committed to the sport. The financial pressure this created threatened to end his career before it had truly begun, forcing him to take employment that drained the energy he needed for training while providing barely enough income to sustain his athletic pursuits. The turning point arrived not through any single dramatic confrontation but through a gradual accumulation of evidence that left the federation with no room to maneuver. He had continued competing despite every obstacle, entering events from which he had not been explicitly barred and delivering performances that demanded recognition. His times improved steadily, moving from nationally competitive to internationally significant to genuinely world-class. The gaps between his results and those of the athletes the federation preferred to promote grew so large that manipulation of selection criteria could no longer maintain the facade of meritocracy. International observers began asking why this clearly exceptional athlete was absent from major competitions, their inquiries creating diplomatic complications that the federation was ill-equipped to manage. The foreign press, less invested in maintaining the pretenses of the domestic sporting establishment, published articles documenting the pattern of discrimination that had shaped his career. These reports circulated back to his home country, generating public pressure that the federation could not entirely ignore. A compromise emerged, grudging and incomplete but representing a significant shift from the total exclusion that had previously prevailed. He would be permitted to compete at the Continental Championships, the first major international event at which he would have the opportunity to demonstrate his abilities against the best athletes from other nations. The conditions attached to this permission revealed the federation's continuing hostility. He would receive no financial support for travel or accommodation. He would not be included in the official team delegation, required instead to make his own arrangements for transportation and lodging. He would have no access to the coaching staff or medical personnel who would be available to other athletes. He was being set up to fail, given the formal opportunity to compete while being denied the practical support that success would require. The journey to the championship venue became an odyssey that tested every dimension of his resilience. Lacking the funds for commercial travel, he relied on a network of supporters who arranged transportation in stages, driving him across state lines in personal vehicles, housing him in spare bedrooms and church basements along the route. The trip that official team members completed in comfortable chartered flights took him nearly a week, during which he struggled to maintain the training regimen that his body required. He arrived at the competition site exhausted, undernourished, and without any of the logistical support that other athletes took for granted. The federation officials present made no effort to conceal their expectation that he would embarrass himself, that his performances would validate their years of obstruction. Other athletes looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, having heard stories of his abilities but seeing before them only a tired young man in worn equipment who seemed out of place among the polished representatives of well-funded national programs. The preliminary rounds began badly, his times reflecting the physical toll of his journey rather than his true capabilities. Federation officials exchanged satisfied glances, already composing the narratives they would offer to explain his failure. But something changed as the competition progressed, something that the saboteurs had failed to anticipate despite all their experience with institutional manipulation. He stopped thinking about the obstacles, stopped calculating the odds against him, stopped measuring himself against expectations that had been designed to constrain him. He simply ran, accessing reserves of capacity that seemed to materialize from nowhere, transcending the limitations of his preparation through sheer force of competitive will. The final of his primary event assembled a field that included reigning champions and world record holders, athletes who had trained in optimal conditions with unlimited resources and who entered the competition expecting to divide the medals among themselves. He had barely qualified for this final, his preliminary times ranking him near the bottom of the field and consigning him to an outside lane that conventional wisdom suggested was disadvantageous. The starting blocks he crouched behind were unfamiliar, different from the models on which he had practiced, requiring last-minute adjustments that added to the psychological pressure of the moment. As he waited for the starter's commands, he became aware of a strange calm descending over his consciousness, a clarity that seemed to silence the doubts and distractions that normally accompanied high-stakes competition. The gun fired, and he launched himself forward with an explosiveness that surprised even him, as though the stored frustration of years of sabotage had been converted instantaneously into kinetic energy. The first 100 meters established a pace that his competitors had not anticipated, forcing them to abandon their race plans and respond to a challenge they had not expected to face. By the midpoint of the race, the outcome had already been decided, though the spectators and broadcast commentators had not yet fully processed what they were witnessing. He was not merely winning. He was producing a performance so far beyond what the field could match that the competition had become a formality. He crossed the finish line with the largest margin of victory in the history of the championships, his time representing a new continental record that shattered the previous mark by a margin that statisticians would later describe as unprecedented. The aftermath of this victory revealed the depth of institutional resistance that still remained. Federation officials initially refused to confirm the result, claiming irregularities in the timing equipment that required verification. When technical examination revealed no such irregularities, they shifted to questioning whether he had committed a false start that officials had failed to detect, demanding review of video evidence that clearly showed a legal departure from the blocks. The medal ceremony was delayed for hours while these challenges were considered and rejected, the young champion forced to wait in uncertainty while bureaucrats searched for any basis on which to invalidate his triumph. When the gold medal was finally placed around his neck, the Federation officials who should have been celebrating the success of their countrymen were notably absent, their seats in the VIP section conspicuously empty. He returned home to a reception that revealed the contradictions of his position within the sport. Black communities celebrated his achievement with an intensity that reflected their understanding of what he had overcome, recognizing in his victory a defeat of the systems that had sought to constrain him. But the mainstream sporting establishment maintained its posture of skeptical distance, treating his continental championship as an anomaly rather than a confirmation of abilities that should have been recognized years earlier. The Federation continued its campaign of obstruction, merely adjusting tactics to account for the new reality of an athlete who had proven his caliber on the international stage. Sponsorship negotiations were sabotaged through bureaucratic delays. Training facility access remained restricted. Coaching support was offered and then withdrawn. The message was clear. One victory, however spectacular, would not be permitted to change the fundamental dynamics that governed his relationship with the sporting establishment. The years that followed became an extended demonstration of what becomes possible when extraordinary talent refuses to accept imposed limitations. He continued to compete, continued to win, continued to shatter records and exceed expectations despite the ongoing campaign of institutional sabotage. Each victory required overcoming not merely the challenges of athletic competition but the additional burden of obstacles deliberately created by those who should have been supporting his development. He became his own coach, his own nutritionist, his own physiotherapist, his own sports psychologist, mastering disciplines that elite athletes typically delegated to specialized support staff. The training methods he developed out of necessity eventually proved superior to the conventional approaches followed by his better-resourced competitors, his improvisations generating innovations that sports scientists would later study and systematize. His competition record accumulated victories that could not be explained away or minimized, a body of achievement so comprehensive that the Federation eventually exhausted its capacity for resistance. International governing bodies, responding to the undeniable evidence of his excellence, began applying pressure that domestic officials could not indefinitely withstand. The selection criteria that had been manipulated to exclude him were reformed under threat of sanctions that would have affected the entire national program. The whisper campaigns that had damaged his reputation were countered by the testimony of fellow athletes who had witnessed his treatment and were willing to speak publicly about what they had seen. The transformation of his status within the sport occurred gradually, then suddenly, as institutional resistance collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence and external pressure. He was named to national teams from which he had previously been excluded. He received the coaching support and training facilities that should have been available from the beginning of his career. Sponsors who had been warned away by federation interference now competed for association with an athlete whose story of perseverance had captured public imagination. The young man who had trained alone in frigid gymnasiums with salvaged equipment now had access to the most advanced sports science facilities in the world, yet he never fully abandoned the improvisational approaches that had carried him through years of sabotage. These methods had become part of his identity as an athlete, sources of competitive advantage that could not be replicated by opponents who had never been forced to develop such resourcefulness. His performances continued to improve even after the obstacles had been removed, suggesting that the sabotage had paradoxically contributed to his development by forcing him to discover capabilities that might otherwise have remained latent. The Federation officials who had devoted such effort to limiting his success now scrambled to associate themselves with his achievements, their earlier obstruction conveniently forgotten in the glow of reflected glory that accompanied his international triumphs. He responded to these overtures with a dignity that refused both bitterness and naive forgiveness, acknowledging the changed circumstances while never pretending that the history of mistreatment had not occurred. The culmination of his career arrived at an Olympic Games that felt almost destined from the moment he secured his qualification. The young black athlete who had been systematically sabotaged was now among the favorites in multiple events, his combination of natural ability and hard-won experience making him a threat to champions from around the world. The opening ceremony found him marching with a national team that had once refused to acknowledge his existence, wearing a uniform that represented membership in an athletic community that had been denied to him for so long. The weight of history sat heavily on his shoulders, but it was a weight he had learned to carry, had transformed into fuel for performances that transcended individual achievement. His events unfolded as confirmations of everything his journey had taught him about the relationship between adversity and excellence. He won gold medals in competitions where the margin of victory reflected not merely his physical superiority but the mental strength developed through years of institutional opposition. Competitors who had trained in ideal conditions with unlimited support found themselves unable to match an athlete forged in the furnace of systematic discrimination. The Olympic records he set stood as permanent testimony to what becomes possible when talent refuses to be suppressed, when determination proves stronger than the forces arrayed against it. His final race of the Games produced a performance that commentators struggled to describe adequately, a moment of athletic transcendence that seemed to suspend the normal rules of physical limitation. He crossed the finish line having achieved what the saboteurs had worked so hard to prevent, having become, through their opposition, something greater than he might otherwise have been. The legacy of his career extends far beyond the medals and records that document his competitive achievements. He became a symbol of resistance against institutional discrimination, proof that systematic sabotage can be overcome through a combination of extraordinary talent and unbreakable will. Young black athletes who followed him into the sport found pathways that had been created by his struggles, opportunities that existed because he had forced open doors that were intended to remain closed. The federation that had worked so diligently to limit his success was eventually transformed, its leadership replaced by officials who understood that excellence recognizes no boundaries of race or origin. The training methods he had developed out of necessity were studied and adopted, becoming standard practice in programs around the world. He had not merely won despite the sabotage. He had become unstoppable because of it, had converted every obstacle into fuel for achievements that no amount of institutional opposition could prevent. His story serves as permanent reminder that the greatest victories often belong to those who have the most to overcome, that adversity can become the foundation of excellence when met with sufficient determination. The athlete they sabotaged became, in the end, a force that transformed not merely his own sport but the broader understanding of what becomes possible when talent refuses to accept imposed limitations.